All around the world, hidden in museum storerooms, are the fossil bones of animals most people never knew existed. They belong to a group of creatures that rivaled the dinosaurs in size and ferocity. Now, Walking with Beasts has brought these creatures back to life, and this program will reveal the incredible story of how they came to dominate the Earth. They are the mammals. Surprisingly, the very first mammals appeared on Earth at the same time as the dinosaurs. But the dinosaurs quickly took over, and during their 160 million year reign, the mammals made little impression.
The first mammals would have looked like shrews or mice. They were tiny creatures, most of them. Some were so small that if you find the fossils, they're minute compared to the dinosaurs. If you look at this tiny jaw, this is a complete jaw of one of the early mammals, and you can see compared to the jaw size of this dinosaur, if you reconstructed the body of this, it would be about the size of one of T. Rex's teeth.
The mammals looked destined for obscurity, but they were dealt an odd stroke of luck. 65 million years ago, the Earth encountered a few problems. It was the end of the dinosaurs. A few groups of animals struggled through this Armageddon, and the mammals were among them. Today, the world is dominated by a magnificent variety of mammals. But they owe their success to a remarkable set of characteristics that were there from the beginning. Features that made them uniquely adaptable. A warm-blooded metabolism helps maintain their body temperature and live life at high speed. Their fur coat means they can withstand a range of temperatures and so live in an amazing variety of habitats. They produce milk and care for their young, giving them a head start in a dog-eat-dog world. And they come equipped with a variety of different shaped teeth, which means they can munch their way through almost anything. They even have large brains, so they can learn as they grow and are able to adapt as they face new challenges. To recreate this remarkable story of evolution, Walking with Beasts teamed up with scientists and special effects artists. At every stage, the sculptors and model makers relied on studies of the fossils to put flesh on the bare bones. They even took expert advice on where to take their animals to feed and drink. And on the computer, scientists advised animators on how to get the animals up on their feet. Perhaps the biggest challenge was trying to work out how they might have behaved, especially when all that was left of these creatures were a few bones and teeth. Fortunately, paleontologists can tell a lot about a mammal from its teeth.
Mammal teeth are hugely variable. Whereas dinosaurs only had 2 or 3 different kinds of teeth, mammals have dozens and dozens of different kinds, and they're hugely different. This is a tooth of a mammoth, just like the tooth of a living elephant. Here's the root, here's the grinding surface, and it's ridged with these thickened structures across here. Whereas other kinds of mammals have very different sorts of teeth. This is a cave hyena, giant hyena, where the teeth are quite different. At the front here are the incisors, here are the canines for piercing flesh, and towards the back, these extraordinary broad, sharp-edged teeth, which are used for crushing and smashing bone. If you look at the teeth of a mammal, you can usually tell very quickly what it ate. So this little chap here has got sharp, pointed teeth, and they would have been used for piercing the outer carapace of insects. So this is probably an insect eater of some sort. This one here is obviously a flesh eater. When you look at these vast pointed teeth, here's the canine tooth, which would be used for piercing through flesh. The incisors at the front are just as fearsome for cutting up flesh and bone. And towards the back, there are these massive cutting teeth for shredding up flesh, for cutting through bone, for chewing and reducing it before it was swallowed. And then when you look at the teeth of this rather strange-looking creature from South America, immediately you can see from the shape of the incisors, they look a bit human-like. They're not very sharp. This is clearly a plant eater. And towards the back, in the jaws here, the molar teeth, the cheek teeth, are broad, grinding surfaces, rather like teeth of horses or of cattle.
The dinosaurs were lucky. They lived through a period of extraordinary stability in Earth's history. The weather forecast for 160 million years was warm and humid. But mammals have had to deal with a different kind of world, one that would keep the best forecasters guessing. This unpredictable place saw huge fluctuations in climate. Seasons arrived, forests came and went, whole habitats were created and destroyed. And the ice caps just kept on growing. The last 65 million years of the Earth's history has been a roller coaster ride. For the mammals, it was adapt or die, just how they seem to like it. Their first test, after the Earth had recovered from the Great Extinction, was to adapt to a world completely covered by tropical forests. Just south of Frankfurt in Germany, there is a spectacular fossil site with evidence of just how different the world was 49 million years ago. This is a unique glimpse into a time when mammals had just begun to take off. The paleontologists have discovered that this abandoned mine was once surrounded by lush tropical forest and full of an extraordinary collection of animals.
We have some of the weirdest animals I know of in the history of mammals at all. Extremely small horses with about 30 centimeters high, extremely large predaceous birds, 2 meters high. Leptoctidium is one of the strangest animals which lived here, running or hopping on two legs, and nothing today is like that.
These so-called messel sediments gradually built up over millions of years, capturing an entire ecosystem. The detail in these fossils is exquisite. In some, the fur outline of the entire body is still visible. In others, you can see the remains of the last meal inside their stomachs. The rocks have revealed an extraordinary explosion in diversity. Almost every group of modern mammal can trace its earliest members to this time.
It's an amazing time for the history of mammals, because we have not only these weird mammals, but also a lot of mammals which are parts of the groups we know today.
Some, like the bats and anteaters, haven't changed much for millions of years. But others, like the early horse, were very different back then.
If you compare the small muscle horse with the horse today, you will not think that this is the same kind of animal, but indeed it is. And this is why this site is so fascinating.
Although it was about the size of a cat, this Propaletherium is the forerunner of modern horses. It has all the same features, but in miniature. Though instead of one hoof, it has several hoof-like toes.
Okay, cut there.
Varied though they were, one thing the mammals all had in common was their size.
Most of the early mammals were quite small. They were living in tropical forests, and they got a bit bigger than they had been in the age of the dinosaurs, but probably not much bigger than pig-sized. They were living below the trees. Some of them were able to climb the trees and adapt to different kinds of diets. They couldn't get very big, though, in those forests.
So, if mammals were small, who were top of the food chain? Looking at their modern descendants, you might find it hard to believe, but mammals once lived in mortal fear of birds. Never underestimate the power of a beak.
I just gave Riley a Brazil nut, a nut that would be extraordinarily difficult for us to crack. We can't do it with our teeth. It takes tools for us to do it, whereas Riley, with a skull this big, can actually crack that nut just using its skull.
Now imagine a very, very big Riley.
The first thing you see when you see the skull of this extinct bird is that it obviously could have delivered a pretty impressive bite.
The skull belonged to a gigantic 2-meter-tall bird called Diatryma, or Gastornis.
Now, if we compare Riley's skull, about this big, to the skull of these gigantic birds, we can see that this animal is way overbuilt for cracking anything like nuts.
In fact, Gastornis was over-engineered in many ways compared to modern birds.
There are some large flightless birds around today, such as the ostrich, but it's obvious that it's built along completely different lines. It has a relatively tiny skull, certainly not the massively constructed large skull that we see in these extinct birds.
Gastornis was big and powerful and specialized in one thing: eating mammals.
An animal like Gastornis or Diatryma with such powerfully constructed jaws is able to eat struggling prey, eat vertebrates. Perhaps not just to eat the flesh, but to actually crack open the bones within and extract the highly nutritious marrow within those bones.
Gastornis was a gruesome reminder of something that had come before.
In many respects, these birds were basically doing the same thing as a Tyrannosaurus or any of the other predatory dinosaurs, and many of these little mammals running around may have viewed them pretty much the same way.
And if the world had stayed covered in tropical forest, then it's possible that birds, rather than mammals, would have remained in charge. But while predatory birds ruled the roost on land, some mammals found escape in the most unlikely place for a furry, four-legged creature: the water. Here they started to grow very, very big indeed, eventually leading to the largest animals ever, the whales. Whales are proof of the amazing adaptability of mammals. But how these 150-ton beasts evolved from small tree-dwelling creatures has been one of the greatest scientific mysteries. For over a century, scientists have been scouring the Earth for fossils of the original ancestors of whales on land. In the 1920s, an intrepid American called Roy Chapman Andrews led a huge expedition to Mongolia to discover fossils. One of his most spectacular finds was the skull of a large hoofed carnivore. Close examination of its teeth revealed surprising similarities between them and those of whales. It turned out to be a distant relative.
It's extraordinary when you look at a living whale or a dolphin and realize that at one time its ancestor was a land-living creature which would have looked something like a pig or a giant dog or something like that. But over the years, of course, the skeleton and the skull and the teeth of mammals can adapt and does adapt and has adapted quite rapidly.
No one knows what prompted hoofed carnivores to take the plunge and eventually become swift swimmers. In fact, nearly all mammals can swim. It's just that most would rather not. But by studying living animals, it is just possible to work out how mammals could have made this remarkable transition. And as it happens, the world's expert on swimming mammals is Dr. Frank Fish. He believes he's uncovered how an ancient landlubber could become an expert swimmer.
If we look at this dog paddling, what you can see is all four of the limbs stroking the water in an alternate fashion. But what a dog paddle really represents is sort of a trot that the animal is doing while it's in the water. It isn't a very efficient gait.
A mammal that is equally at home in the water and on land is the otter. Otters seem to represent what a missing link between whales and land mammals might look like, making them a fascinating animal to study, even if they're not always cooperative. Dr. Fish is trying to record their unique swimming action on a special slow-motion camera.
Great.
In the lab, he has discovered there are a few simple changes in swimming style that enable a land mammal to swim more like a seal and less like a dog.
What we find is instead of using all four legs, the otter is instead using just its hind legs. Its front legs are tucked up underneath it, and the hind legs then are paddling simultaneously.
The otters are not just running in the water, they are using their back feet together to act as a paddle and allowing their spine to flex up and down, driving them forward. It's a much more efficient stroke.
Otters represent a transitional stage, something intermediate between both land and water. And because of that, they're really of interest because They probably represent, at least in a modern form, what the ancestors of animals like dolphins may have been like.
But otters are modern animals. No one had ever found an otter-like ancestor to the whales, a missing link between land and sea. Then, in 1992, at a remote dig site in Pakistan, paleontologists discovered a remarkable set of bones. They seemed to assemble a creature made up of an assortment of parts, one that could live on land and in the water. Its discovery was a triumph for scientists. It was the elusive missing link. It was called Ambulocetus, which appropriately means walking whale.
When I first saw an Ambulocetus skeleton, the bones were robust. They remind you of semi-aquatic animals such as otters. Ambulocetus probably moved somewhat like otters today. It had expanded limbs in terms of its hands and feet, which were probably webbed, so it could develop thrust in a paddling manner. It also had a robust tail and probably was starting, like otters, to use the tail motion to produce thrust.
Ambulocetus was a creature totally new to science, and Dr. Fisher's work helped the Walking with Beasts team to make it move, both on land and in the water. But Ambulocetus wasn't the end of the whale's tale. After all, it was an animal still tied to land. It didn't explain how whales became larger and truly aquatic. This was the next stage in the story. It's the last place on Earth you'd expect to find anything to do with water. But here in the Sahara Desert, there is evidence that some underwater creatures once lived here. It's a place that has intrigued marine paleontologist Dr. Mark Ewan.
40 million years ago, this whole area was covered with a vast ocean that we call the Tethys Sea. It extended from the North Atlantic across the Mediterranean and covering much of North Africa and northern India. And the water would have come in here not just covering the valleys, but covering even the highest peaks. And all the layers that you see here were once the ocean bottom. You can see evidence for that all over the place here. Here's an oyster shell. Here's a snail. And I even found a shark tooth. These are all things you just don't expect to find in the desert.
Something else you don't expect to find are giant whales. When skeletons like these were first discovered in the 19th century, they were thought to be the remains of huge sea serpents. They were named Basilosaurus, which means king lizard. But Basilosaurus was no giant lizard. It has a mouthful of unmistakably mammalian teeth.
This is the snout of the animal, and this is the roof of the mouth. And these are the incisors. These are the front teeth, here, here, and here. And as you get further back, you see the teeth have two roots. You see two here, and two here. Basilosaurus has actually very few teeth compared to modern toothed whales, and has the number of teeth much more like primitive mammals. They use their front teeth to grab on to prey, and then they use their back teeth to chew their food, unlike modern toothed whales which swallow their food whole.
This area in Egypt was named Valley of the Whales because the desert floor is littered with the remains of Basilosaurus. These creatures were giant predators, but they weren't quite like modern whales yet. Their bodies were long and snake-like, and they still had some primitive characteristics that linked them back to their ancestors on land.
These are the back legs of Basilosaurus. You can see here the pelvis, the femur, the kneecap, the lower leg, and the foot, which even has little toes on it. These tiny hind legs weren't attached to the backbone, and their small size shows us that they couldn't support the body weight on land. So if they weren't used for walking, what could they have been used for? Well, one idea is they were used as sexual claspers, that the male and female used them to hook up during mating and hold on while they mated.
At 18 meters long, Basilosaurus was probably the largest animal on Earth at that time. It presented a real challenge for the scientists and special effects artists to make it work properly. The scale model had to be shrunk to fit, and it still took 4 people to control it.
Giving a feeling of sort of sinister.
And working out how to get an extinct animal to swim was a combination of artistic skill and scientific advice.
So how would you like to see these do you call these back legs or?
They are back
They are
legs.
essentially back legs, right.
I'd like to see them, if the joints will do it,
Yeah.
like just trailing, pointing absolutely straight back.
Just right. Okay, yeah, sure.
Like the feet of an otter, for example.
Right, okay. Yeah, sure thing.
Now at last, the story can be told of how hoofed carnivores evolved webbed feet and started to swim. Eventually their backbones loosened, their legs got smaller, and their tails turned into flukes. The mystery of how a group of mammals conquered the water was complete. Whales represented the mammals' first attempts to get truly enormous. But land mammals were not far behind, and they got their chance once the climate turned against the rainforests. Life on Earth came under the influence of one continent, Antarctica. Over millions of years, the other continents moved away, leaving it isolated over the South Pole. Gradually, the continent became colder and colder until a permanent ice cap formed. This triggered a change in the world's climate. It meant a drop in global rainfall. Rainforests shrank, making way for new habitats.
There were all sorts of changes going on. Climates were changing worldwide. It was getting somewhat cooler, and there was the beginnings of the retreat of the forests as those climates changed, and animals were creeping out and going onto the plain.
All this change played into the hands of the land mammals. Birds lost their place at the top of the food chain, and mammals seized the opportunity to move into the open.
So that gave a big advantage to large size, because if you're out on a plain, out of the forest, out of the protection, if you're big, you can escape predation, you can run faster and get away from the predators.
The changing climate created a new breed of giants. The age of the mammals had truly arrived, and it was ugly. This is Entelodont, not the kind of thing you'd want to meet, even in a nightmare, unless you happen to be a paleontologist like Dr. Scott Foss.
I've often thought about what it would be like to meet an Entelodont. I always imagine these as being creatures that were just really would have an attitude. They'd walk into a room and say, "I'm here."
No one would argue with such a mouthful of weapons.
The mouth of the Entelodont is pretty incredible. And we know from these huge muscles up here that would pull on the jaw, that these animals had a very strong, powerful bite, and they were able to grab onto things and twist and rip it away. I'd say the words would be pulverized, breaking, mashing, crushing, grinding, grabbing things and dragging them and twisting them and pulling them. They were scavengers, they were generalists. They could do anything they really wanted to do.
But even the biggest, nastiest creatures have their enemies.
From looking at entelodon skulls, we find bite marks, sometimes in the side of the face, right up here. We find it right up here in the forehead. And sometimes we even find bite marks in the roof of the mouth. And if you can imagine that, bite marks into these creatures, what creature could do that? What creature could get its jaws around an entelodon? Another entelodont. We know that because their teeth actually could have made those bite marks. Also, there's not a single other animal alive at the time that could have made bite marks like that. So we're pretty sure it was entelodonts doing this to each other. The big question is why? Well, today animals will do battle with other animals of their species, mostly for mate competition or territory competition. It's probably a form of competition, a very painful form of competition.
Entelodonts were the ultimate all-purpose animals, built like tanks and able to eat anything. A typical mammalian success story.
It's really hard to say why we don't have entelodonts today, why they didn't make it. I suspect if we were to release entelodonts into North America today, they might do very well. These things are generalists. They'd eat anything in front of them. I imagine they'd especially like potato chips and hot dogs and things like that. They'd probably do very well until they got into a populated area, and that would be the end of this. I don't think there'd be room for both people and an entelodont in some suburban neighborhoods.
The entelodonts were a new breed of large mammal. But it wasn't long before they were upstaged by the largest land mammals ever to live. On Roy Chapman Andrews' expedition in Mongolia, the Dig Diary records the discovery of a single bone big as a man's body. Some of those enormous bones found their way to the Natural History Museum in London. Bones over a meter long should be easy to find, but there are a lot of bones in the Natural History Museum for paleontologist Professor Mikhail Fortilius to search through.
This is the bone of a very large animal. If I found this somewhere, I would probably think that it was an elephant. Because it's very, very large, but in some ways it's like a giraffe, and in some ways even like a rhinoceros. But it isn't like anything alive today, and it's much, much bigger than anything that lives today.
It took scientists a while to work out what sort of creature it was. The only thing that was clear was that it was big.
This thing here is the neck vertebra of a medium-sized rhinoceros from the Ice Age. And it's, well, it's a large bone, but it's nothing compared to this, which is huge.
They had found an ancient type of rhino called an Indracothea.
When we think of large land animals, we always think of dinosaurs. And dinosaurs were the largest land animals that we know about. But some of the land mammals also got very large, such as this Indracothea here, which stands 7 to 8 meters tall, is about as long, and would have weighed perhaps up to 15 tons. And as you can see, I don't even reach up to the top of its legs.
The Indracotheas were rhinos trying to beat giraffes. They had long necks to reach the treetops, but everything about them was massive and heavy like a rhino. They were an extraordinary feat of engineering. But these monsters were gentle giants, browsing only on tender young leaves. In the case of the Indracotheas, that was a lot of leaves.
Why be big? Well, of course, it means that you have nothing that's going to hunt you. There is no predator that's big enough to eat you. But the danger of being big is, of course, you can be quite vulnerable because population sizes, if you think of elephants, are quite small, and it doesn't take much to drive a large animal to extinction.
And the days of the Indracotheas were numbered as the Earth changed again. Antarctica's increasing isolation brought a shiver to the climate. As ice spread at the South Pole, it shifted the weather patterns, bringing new seasonal extremes of drought and deluge. Out of the turmoil, an astonishing new plant evolved, one that we couldn't imagine life without. It was grass.
People often think that grass has always been on the Earth. It's so common, it's everywhere. You even see pictures of dinosaurs wandering about on grassy fields, but that's not possible. The first grasses appeared in the fossil record about 30 or 40 million years ago. And when they appeared, they did take over. There was a change in climates which got drier. The centers of continents became great savannas. And as the savannas grew, the grasslands expanded, the woodlands that had been the early home of the mammals disappeared or to the fringes. The mammals had to adapt. They came down from the trees, out from under the trees. They became bigger, longer legs, hooves, able to run faster, and their teeth had to adapt.
Many of the animals that browsed on leaves went into decline. In their place came a new breed of mammals, the grazers. But grass is surprisingly difficult to survive on. Luckily, mammals had the answer. They developed a battery of teeth, complex stomachs, and long legs to follow the grass wherever it sprouted. But where there was meat on the hoof, predators were quick to follow. The competition for survival brought with it some of the most deadly animals on Earth.
If we look at the evolution of cats, indeed the evolution of other predators, we can see that they've got faster, they've got bigger, they've got better at what they do. Equally, the prey species have got faster, bigger, better at what they do, which is to escape. There's what you might call an evolutionary arms race between the two. The prey want to get away, the predators want to catch them. And so over time, there has been a tendency to do the best they can, to reach the optimum solution.
The cat family are the ultimate predators. No other mammal is such a finely tuned assassin.
What makes a cat such an efficient killing mechanism? Well, these tiger cubs are 4 months old, and already they've got all the attributes that they'll need, just in a smaller form. They've got large feet, very large paws, long claws, very sharp. They've got teeth that are able to slice off meat, able to bite into the prey, able to kill it. They've got whiskers to sense exactly where the item is so that it can bite precisely. They're strong, well-muscled, and they're fast-moving. So the whole package combines together to make an animal that really is superbly equipped for what it needs to do.
A full-grown Siberian tiger can weigh as much as 300 kilograms and is the largest cat today. But compared to some of its ancestors, it would look like a pussy cat. There was a creature that died out just a few thousand years ago with the most lethal weapons of any carnivore. It was called Smilodon, the fabled saber-toothed cat with its 20-centimeter long teeth. Although the sabers were Smilodon's most dramatic feature, it's the whole package that made it such a lethal killing machine.
If you look at the skeleton as a whole, it was a very, very strongly built cat. The forequarters in particular, the front legs, the shoulders, the neck, are extremely heavily built. Like many cats living today, it was probably fast over a short distance. It was probably an ambush predator able to sprint out from cover, using its speed in order to close the distance very quickly, and then using its great strength to seize the prey and pull it down.
Thanks, Alex. I think I should use it in the end.
As usual, it's the teeth that really tell you how Smilodon went about its business.
If you look at the skull of a Smilodon, your eye is immediately drawn to these saber teeth. But it's got teeth at the back here that are equipped for slicing meat. It's got teeth at the front that are equipped for pulling meat off, getting it into the mouth. It's got large upper canine teeth that are equipped for slicing into the prey once it's held immobilized. So everything about it shouts predator at us. This is not an animal that can eat grass or vegetation. It's a predator, it's a killer.
The giant sabers were there for one gruesome purpose: to be driven into the neck of the prey and in one bite to rip its throat out. Although the mammals seemed to be on top of the world, conquering every habitat, the Earth was about to create the biggest challenge yet: life in the freezer. Both of the Earth's poles began to freeze over 2.5 million years ago. The Ice Age had begun. Ice sheets grew beyond the Arctic Circle over much of the Northern Hemisphere, transforming all plant and animal life. At the height of the Ice Age, there were icebergs off the coast of Ireland, permafrost beneath London, and glaciers reached as far south as New York. For most animals, it became an inhospitable place. But some mammals took the cold in their stride. Europe, North America, and Siberia became filled with some of the most spectacular animals the world has ever seen.
Right, don't drop it on the ground yet.
Exotic giants from the tropics evolved to suit the conditions further north.
Elephants originally evolved as tropical animals, but the mammoths developed a very specialized adaptation to extremely cold climates. They had a thick coat of woolly fur. They had small ears so that they didn't lose heat through their ears. They had a thick layer of subcutaneous fat, short back legs so that they, again, did not lose heat. The long tusks were used to clear away snow because they fed primarily on grasses and other small plants. One of their most specialized adaptations was the tip of their trunk, which had on it 2 large fingers that allowed them to feed on the very small plants that were their main subsistence items.
All these magnificent creatures were around until so recently that instead of simply finding bones, there are the remains of their skin and hair preserved in the ice. These finds provide unique information on what these extinct animals looked like. Sometimes it has even been possible to recreate specific events in their lives. Whole mammoth carcasses were found in the prime of life, having been trapped in frozen ponds. In some cases, the flesh from their bodies could still be eaten. The Ice Age was one of the harshest environments imaginable, but mammals were tough enough to meet this challenge. Their trademark fur and assortment of teeth kept them warm and well fed. But having survived and thrived for so long, something mysterious was about to happen.
The giant mammals of the Ice Age, such as the mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, Megaloceros, the giant Irish elk, were all very successful animals and survived for a very long period of time in a harsh climate. Yet they disappeared relatively abruptly. What caused that disappearance?
Around 30,000 years ago, most of the giant mammals across the world started to become extinct, so that by 10,000 years ago, as the Ice Age came to an end, almost all had died out. The mammals had flourished despite every change that the Earth had thrown at them. They'd even survived an Ice Age. So why did the large ones suddenly vanish? There is one group of mammals we haven't talked about, the primates. They were there at the beginning and kept pace as the Earth changed. And then only a few thousand years ago, one species became fantastically successful. Could humans have had a hand in this catastrophe? Find out if we wiped out the Ice Age giants in the next program, The Beasts Within.
Okay, cut. Thanks very much, everyone. That's a wrap.